Germany lost roughly 500 U-boats during the Battle of the Atlantic. That sounds simple. It is not. Because in May 1945, Germany still had submarines, still had torpedoes, still had trained crews standing at attention on the decks of intact warships. And yet, the Atlantic War was already over. How does a navy lose an ocean while it still has weapons left in its harbors? That is the real question. And the answer is not the one most documentaries give you. It is not radar. It is not sonar. It is not code-breaking. It is not the convoy system. Those things mattered, but they are not the reason Germany lost. The reason is something much harder to see, much harder to rebuild, and much harder to admit. Something that went down with every single one of those 500 boats, and could not be replaced no matter how many shipyards kept working. This is the story of what really sank in the Atlantic. Picture a harbor in northern Norway in the final days of the war. Trondheim, cold gray water, a line of long, dark hulls tied to the piers. Inside those hulls, diesel fuel, loaded torpedo tubes, functioning engines. Men in clean uniforms waiting for orders that will never come. By every visible measure, this is still a fleet. A British officer steps onto the gangway and accepts a surrender that, on paper, makes no sense. The Germans have submarines. The Germans have weapons. Why are they not still fighting? To understand what happened in that harbor, you have to go back to a quiet, intense man who built the entire campaign in his head years before it began. Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz did not look like a warrior. He was thin, formal, almost professorial. As a young officer in the First World War, he had watched Germany pour its national pride into enormous battleships that spent most of the war sitting at anchor, too valuable to lose. He came out of that war convinced the future of naval power was not bigger surface fleets. It was something smaller, hidden, and far more dangerous. His reasoning was almost mathematical. Britain was an island. Everything Britain needed to fight a war crossed the sea. Oil, food, ammunition. Soldiers from Canada and India. If German submarines could sink ships faster than the Allies could build them, Britain would slowly run out of the things it needed to keep fighting. No invasion. No occupation. Just subtraction. He called it tonnage warfare. Sink more than they can replace. The numbers would do the rest. And for one frightening stretch of the war, the numbers worked. Imagine the North Atlantic in the autumn of 1940. Low clouds, black water. A convoy of 40 merchant ships moving in long, ragged rows, lit only by the occasional shielded lamp on a bridge wing. Somewhere in that darkness, on the surface, a single submarine slides between the columns. Inside its conning tower stands a young commander named Otto Kretschmer. He is in his late 20s, soft-spoken on land, almost shy. At sea, he is something else entirely. Kretschmer has invented a technique the British have no answer for. Instead of attacking from underwater, he runs his submarine on the surface at night, slips inside the protective ring of escort ships, and fires at point-blank range from the heart of the convoy itself. He sums up his method in 4 words. One shot. One hit. He is not alone. Across the Atlantic in those months, another commander, Günther Prien, becomes one of the most famous men in Germany after a daring operation against the Royal Navy's anchorage at Scapa Flow. Another, Joachim Schepke, becomes a regular face in German newsreels. German sailors give this period a name. They call it Die glückliche Zeit, the happy time. In Berlin, staff officers update charts on the wall like accountants. How much tonnage sunk this week? How much last month? The line keeps climbing. Newspapers print the totals next to photographs of returning crews. Brass bands meet the boats at the dockside. Crowds throw flowers. Young commanders dine with admirals. This is not propaganda. This is a strategy succeeding in real time. And buried inside that success is the trap that will destroy everything. 3,000 miles away, In a shipyard outside Richmond, California, a man named Henry Kaiser is asking a question no one in Berlin is asking. Kaiser is not a sailor. He has never built an ocean-going ship in his life. He is a road builder. He built dams. He looks at the traditional process of constructing a merchant ship, which takes more than a year, and decides the entire approach is wrong. He breaks the ship into sections. He welds instead of rivets. He runs the work in parallel, dozens of pieces being built at the same time in different sheds, all designed to bolt together at the end. The result is crude. It is ugly. It is also fast. By 1943, American yards are launching Liberty ships at a pace of roughly 3 every 2 days. One vessel is assembled in under 5 days, as a public demonstration that the system works. This is the trap closing, and nobody in Berlin sees it. Germany is fighting a war of destruction. America is fighting a war of replacement. A torpedo takes seconds to fire. A Liberty ship rolls off a slipway in roughly 6 weeks. The visible numbers, the ones on the charts in Berlin, still look good. The deeper numbers, the ones nobody is tracking, are already running the wrong way. But the steel race is not even the real story. The real story is the people inside the steel. A U-boat in 1940 was not a machine. It was a craft trade. To command one, a man needed years of preparation that no school could shorten. He needed to calculate firing angles in his head in total darkness. He needed to read the surface of the ocean for the faint shadow of an aircraft before that aircraft saw him. He needed to keep roughly 50 men alive inside a steel cylinder where one mistake at the wrong depth could end everything for everyone aboard. That kind of competence did not appear quickly. It was built the way a craftsman is built, slowly, under masters. Otto Kretschmer was not simply lucky. He had years at sea before the war. He had served under older officers who had themselves served in the First World War. The instincts he carried into combat had been built across 2 generations of submariners. When a younger officer rowed aboard his boat, that younger officer was absorbing something that could not be written into any manual. Then, in March 1941, the cost of all that experience became suddenly, brutally clear. In a single 10-day stretch, the U-boat arm lost 3 of its most prominent commanders. Günther Prien and his crew were lost during operations against an Atlantic convoy. The exact cause has never been determined. The boat simply did not return. 9 days later, during the fight around another convoy southeast of Iceland, British destroyers caught 2 more famous aces in the same engagement. Joachim Schepke and his boat were lost when a destroyer rammed them on the surface. Within the same hour, Otto Kretschmer's submarine was crippled by depth charges. Kretschmer ordered the boat scuttled and was taken prisoner. He would spend the rest of the war in a British camp, far from the Atlantic. 3 of the most successful U-boat commanders in the German Navy, removed from the war in a single week. The Kriegsmarine kept the news quiet for as long as it could. Inside the command, the implications were already being whispered. The men who had written the playbook were being erased from it faster than anyone had planned for, and almost no one in Berlin had a real plan for how to replace them. For a while, the system held. A new commander followed a careful path. Years at sea on surface ships first, then submarine school, then a training flotilla in the calm waters of the Baltic, then, most important of all, a confirmation patrol, where the new officer rode beside an experienced captain, watched him work, and absorbed his judgment under real conditions before being given a boat of his own. It was an apprenticeship. The masters trained the journeymen. The journeymen became masters. Knowledge moved forward in time. Then the masters began to disappear. By the middle of 1942, an internal problem was becoming visible to anyone willing to look at it honestly. Veteran commanders were being lost at a rate the schools could not match. The men replacing them were younger. Many had less time at sea. Some had never crossed the Atlantic before being given command of their own boat. The schools kept issuing certificates. The yards kept rolling out new submarines. On paper, the U-boat force kept growing. But behind that paper, the people inside the boats were now a different generation entirely. They were trying to fight a war that their own instructors had only just begun to understand. Germany was producing submarines on schedule. It was not producing submariners on the same schedule. And the second number was the one that mattered. Here is where the situation moved from a problem to a trap. A veteran commander goes out on patrol. Riding beside him is a junior officer, learning. If the veteran returns home, that knowledge moves forward to the next class. The next generation inherits real, hard-earned judgment. If the veteran does not return, the chain breaks. Not just for one boat. For every future boat the man would have trained. By 1943, the Atlantic had become a sharper, faster ocean. Allied escort groups were now hunting in coordinated teams instead of defending in scattered formations. Long-range aircraft from Britain, Iceland, and Canada were closing the gap in the middle of the Atlantic, where U-boats had once operated without fear of air attack. Newer radar sets could find a surfaced submarine even in fog. Radio direction finding equipment let escorts triangulate any U-boat foolish enough to send a long message to Berlin. Each of these advances, taken alone, was something an experienced commander could adapt to. He would know when to dive, when to stay silent, when to slip away. He had survived close calls before. The hard-learned lesson was already inside him. The newer commander, with less time at sea and fewer mentors left to learn from, made the small mistake that the veteran would have avoided. And every boat lost meant another mentor erased before he could pass on what he knew. The pipeline was not just shrinking. It was shrinking faster than it could shrink. Each lost commander subtracted not one man, but every future commander he would have shaped. You cannot build a man into having survived 10 patrols he was never on. The official numbers hid the bleeding for a long time. A telegram to Berlin in 1943 might list 200 U-boats in commission. That number sounded like a fleet. The reality on the docks at Lorient and Saint-Nazaire was very different. Walk along those piers in your imagination. Long concrete shelters built to protect submarines from bombing. Inside the shelters, boats sitting motionless. Some are in dry dock with damage that will take weeks to repair. Allied bombing is now reaching the French coast and the German home ports hard enough to slow even the legendary concrete pens. Other boats are tied up because there is no fuel. The Allied campaign against synthetic oil plants is working, and the German Navy is rationing diesel for combat patrols. Still other boats are technically ready to sail, but their crews are too inexperienced to be sent against an Atlantic convoy alone, and there are no veterans left available to ride along. A visitor would see what looked like a powerful fleet. He would not see that perhaps a third of it could not actually fight that month. The chart in Berlin was not a lie. It was simply not measuring the right thing. And the month that finally made the truth impossible to hide was coming. May 1943 began like any other month. Wolf packs formed in the North Atlantic. Convoys sailed from Halifax, bound for Liverpool. Radio traffic in the operations room in Berlin hummed with familiar reports. By the end of the first week, the reports were wrong. Convoys were not breaking apart under attack. They were fighting back. Escorts were finding U-boats before the U-boats could fire. Aircraft were appearing over the mid-Atlantic where, only months earlier, the sky had been empty. Boats were going out and simply not coming back. Donitz tracked the losses on a board. 5 boats, then 10, then 20. On May 19th, a message arrived that he received not as an admiral, but as a father. His son Peter, 21 years old, serving as a watch officer aboard one of the boats now overdue, was confirmed lost in the North Atlantic. There is no reliable record of what he said in that moment. The historical record preserves only what he did. He kept working. The reports kept coming. By the end of the month, 41 U-boats had been lost at sea, with 3 more destroyed in port. 44 boats in a single month. On May 24th, Dönitz did something he had never done in 3.5 years of war. He ordered the wolf packs pulled back from the North Atlantic entirely. The officers around him understood what that order meant, even if no one said it aloud. The ocean Dönitz had spent a decade preparing to take was no longer theirs. Most retellings of the war call that month Black May, the beginning of the end. That is not quite right. Black May was not where the collapse began. It was where the collapse finally became visible from inside Berlin. The veterans who might have read the warning signs in 1942 were already gone. The men left to interpret the situation in May were exactly the officers whose inexperience the system had been quietly compounding for 2 years. The Atlantic had been slipping for a year. May simply made it impossible to look away. There would be one more chance. In a Hamburg shipyard in 1944, engineers unveiled what should have been the answer to everything: the Type 21 submarine. Streamlined hull, far greater battery capacity, underwater speeds nearly double anything the Allies had faced, a snorkel that let it charge its batteries without ever fully surfacing. On paper, it could have reopened the Atlantic. It did not reopen anything. Production was crippled by bombing, by shortages of materials, by the chaos of a country running out of nearly everything at once. Only a handful of Type 21s reached operational patrols before the war ended. The rest sat in shipyards. Some were captured in port. Others were surrendered intact at piers like the one at Trondheim where this story began. But even if every Type 21 had been delivered on schedule, a deeper problem could not have been solved. Who would have crewed them? The Kretschmers and the Priens of 1940 were gone. The veterans who could have mastered a radically new submarine, who had the instincts to feel when something was wrong before the instruments confirmed it, had been lost across 3 years of an Atlantic that consumed them faster than the schools could rebuild what they represented. The Type 21 proved that Germany could still design a remarkable machine. It could not prove that Germany could still produce the men capable of using one. So return to the number we began with: 500 U-boats. On paper, it looks like a count of machines, a line in a logistical report, a statistic. It is not. Every one of those losses was a commander whose judgment would never be inherited. Every one was a crew whose hard-earned instincts about Allied tactics, about hydrophone signatures, about which clouds hid aircraft and which did not, disappeared with them. Every one was a chain of mentorship, quietly cut before it could reach the next generation of officers. Every one was a piece of institutional memory that no factory in Germany could ever rebuild, because that memory had never lived in a factory. It had lived inside specific men, under specific commanders, in specific moments at sea, that no document had ever captured. That is why Germany lost the Atlantic. Not because it ran out of submarines, the shipyards never stopped. Not because it ran out of torpedoes. The factories kept running until the final weeks of the war. Not because Allied technology was magic. Radar, sonar, long-range aircraft, and code-breaking all mattered. But they only exposed a weakness that already existed. Germany lost because the Atlantic had become a war of replacement, and the two sides were trying to replace very different things. The Allies had to replace hardware, ships, engines, hulls, steel and welds and rivets, things that could be drawn on a blueprint and stamped out by an industry built specifically to stamp things out at scale. America was uniquely good at that war. It was the war American industry had been preparing to fight without even realizing it. Germany had to replace people, commanders, crews, mentors, judgment, instinct, years of accumulated experience that had only ever existed inside specific human beings. There is no assembly line for that. There never has been. You cannot weld a man into having spent 10 years at sea. You cannot stamp out the quiet confidence of an officer who has already survived everything that has killed other men. That was the war Germany could not win. Not because it was weak, not because it was outmatched in courage or skill or design, but because the thing it most needed to replace was the one thing no nation, however industrial, has ever figured out how to mass produce. By May 1945, the harbor at Trondheim still held submarines, still held torpedoes, still held men in clean uniforms standing on deck. But the experience that had once made those boats so dangerous was no longer there to send them out. That is what truly sank in the Atlantic. Not 500 submarines, 500 irreplaceable accumulations of knowledge, leadership, and memory, lost one patrol at a time, until the Navy that had once come within months of strangling Britain no longer had the human core left to hold the line. The steel was never the story. The people inside the steel always were.